I remember the sound of the sander still humming in my ears long after I switched it off, the faint vibration lingering in my fingers as I stood in that quiet basement workshop staring at the old table I had been restoring, the way some people stare at a wound they can't quite feel yet, and the phone rang upstairs with that tone I had heard too many times before, the tone of trouble arriving dressed as urgency, and I climbed the steps, slowly wiping the dust from my hands, thinking it would be something ordinary. But the moment I heard the voice on the other end, I felt my stomach tighten because that voice carried the exact edge it always had when something was about to be dropped in my lap. Something big, something expensive, something wrapped in panic and expectation, and the words urgent. And tomorrow sat heavy between us, and even before he asked if he could come in the morning and bring the woman at his side, I felt the familiar sinking, the kind that comes when a person knows they are about to be pulled into someone else's mess again. And I said yes, because I always had, because some habits become bones when you're a parent. And I hung up the phone without really breathing for a moment and stood in the middle of that quiet house, hearing the late woman's memory drift somewhere behind me like a warning I had ignored too many times. And the morning came too fast, the car pulling into the driveway looked like a declaration, the polished shine, the matched clothes, the way they walked up my steps, like approaching a boardroom instead of the home, where the boy had once eaten cereal dripping down his chin, and I welcomed them in. Because politeness is a reflex. You don't lose even when you should, and we sat in the same room where celebrations once lived, where laughter used to echo with the late woman's voice, and they didn't touch the coffee, didn't look around, didn't settle. They just unfolded papers and words that didn't sound like language I knew anymore, and suddenly I was listening to numbers that didn't match reality, expenses that made no sense, contracts that should have existed, but didn't, and the request landed in front of me like a stone, $250,000, the kind of money a man saves over decades of careful work and careful living, and love, and loss. And the man across from me said it like he was asking for a ride across town, and the woman nodded as if this were all logical, as if the world naturally bent this way for them, and I stared at him, really stared at him, trying to find the boy who had once asked me how engines breathed, the boy who used to help me in the garage with sawdust on his hair, but the boy wasn't here. This one wore desperation like a cologne, and expectation like armor, saying, "We need you," the way someone says, "Hand over the keys," not the way someone asks for help, and I felt something in my chest pull tight because he kept insisting that I was the only one, and the deadline felt like a trap closing, like they had rehearsed this, like they assumed the answer was already yes, and I said, I needed time, and the flicker of irritation across their faces was so fast I almost thought I imagined it, but I didn't. I know now that look had been there for years, hidden beneath the surface, every time they asked for something large or small, and after they left, I sat in the late woman's chair staring at the fireplace that had watched every chapter of my life unfold, and the number circled my mind over and over, the kind of number that could break a man's future, clean in half. But the truth that gnawed deeper was not the amount, it was the ease, the expectation, the way they spoke as if it was owed to them, as if my decades of labor existed solely to cover the holes in their choices, and I could not shake the unease that this wasn't the real story, that the polished explanation they gave me was just the surface of something hollow, and I forced myself that night to look beyond the love that had blinded me for too long, and I started digging, and with every search, every call, every number, the missing detail, the whole structure began to collapse, and it became clear that the story they told me was built from air and fear rather than reality, and the business they boasted about was a mirage, a set of claims with no weight behind them, no clients, no proof, no foundation, nothing except a lifestyle carved far beyond their means. And I felt rage, but not loud rage, more like a cold clarity wrapping around my ribs, the kind that comes when a truth finally dawns. After years of denial, and when the call came the next day asking for my answer, I felt something steady rise inside me, something I hadn't felt since the late woman was alive, a spine I thought had dissolved into grief, and I asked for real proof, asked for documents that should have existed if their story had been honest, and the silence on the other end told me everything. And when I said no, when I pulled the single small word out of my mouth and placed it between us, The explosion on the line was almost expected. The accusations, the guilt, the twisting of memories, the mention of the late woman's name, used like a weapon. Something I never thought I would hear from him, and that was the moment the last remaining strand inside me snapped a quiet, small break, but final and complete, and I hung up knowing that whatever came next would not be the familiar cycle I had lived trapped within for years. And when the second call came, sharper, colder, dripping with entitlement and threat, it only confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't about survival or dreams. This was about maintaining an illusion, and they wanted me to pay for the upkeep. And I sat alone in my quiet house, with the air thick around me, knowing something irreversible had begun, something necessary, something painful but true. And that was the night I decided I would no longer be the man they believed they could pull apart piece by piece. I sat there in the dim quiet of the living room with the heat vent humming softly in the corner, and the truth I had uncovered still crawling under my skin like something alive and unwelcome. And the more I replayed the calls from earlier, the more the pieces of the past years began rearranging themselves into a shape I could finally recognize, a shape that looked nothing like love and everything like exploitation. And I felt this strange mix of grief and clarity rising in me as I sifted through the memories of every moment. I had stepped in with my wallet instead of my judgment every time I had mistaken enabling for compassion every time. I had believed the best simply because believing the truth would have shattered the illusion of the family I thought I had. And I opened the laptop again because I needed to see it all laid out without emotion, the way an engineer would examine a failing structure, checking each beam, each connection, each bolt. And what I saw was not a structure built poorly. It was one built to deceive, missing supports, fabricated claims, empty promises. And I went through every charge on the account I had once meant to be an emergency lifeline, but had become their personal reservoir, a river that flowed only one direction. And I traced every purchase, every unexplained withdrawal, every luxury that had been disguised as necessity. And each one echoed louder until I had no choice but to accept the truth that they had been living off me far longer and far deeper than I had allowed myself to admit. And when the night settled deeper around the house, I could feel the late woman's absence press against me with a weight that was both familiar and unbearable. Because she had always carried the part of our life that saw things clearly. She had always known how to call things by their real names even when it hurt. And I wondered what she would say if she could see the way her child spoke to me now, the way her memory had been used as leverage, as a bargaining chip, as if her love were a tool to pry open my savings. And that thought burned something inside me, something protective, something raw. And when the inbox chimed with the long, dramatic message demanding the money, one last time laced with guilt, wrapped in threats, coated with the language of betrayal that claimed I was choosing funds over family, I stared at it with a calm so cold it almost frightened me. And I realized then that the person sending that message did not see me as a parent, did not see me as someone who had poured a life into him. He saw me as a resource, the final failing wall he could lean on before everything collapsed under the weight of his own choices. And I closed the message without replying, because some endings don't need words, they need action. And I reached for the phone, not to call him back, not to defend myself, not to argue, but to call someone who dealt with endings and protections and boundaries, someone who could help me redraw my life into something that belonged only to me again. And the meeting the next morning felt strangely freeing, the papers spreading across the polished desk like a map of a future I had forgotten I could choose for myself, and I signed each one carefully, feeling the weight of each signature settle into my spine like armor. The house protection, the accounts moved, the inheritance reshaped into something that honored the late woman's memory, instead of being consumed by people who had no idea what sacrifice meant. And as I left the office with the morning sun hitting my face, I felt lighter, not happy, not relieved, but steady in a way I had not felt in years. And when the doorbell rang that afternoon, and I saw their car pull into the driveway, I felt that steadiness anchor itself deeper, because now I finally understood the person on the other side of the screen door was not coming to reconcile or reason. He was coming to reclaim control. And when he tried the lock and found it changed, the disbelief on his face cracked something open in me like a window, letting in fresh, cold air. And his pounding on the door, his raised voice, His accusations all sounded distant, like echoes bouncing off walls I no longer lived inside, and I opened the main door but kept the screen latched because it felt like a symbolic line, the last thin barrier between who I had been for decades and who I was becoming, now someone who no longer bent under the weight of someone else's demands. And when he asked if I truly meant it, if I truly refused to save him, I spoke with a calm that surprised us both and told him the truth, that I had chosen not to participate in his fantasy, that I had chosen not to fuel the world he had built on borrowed money and borrowed time and borrowed identity. And when his voice rose, when the threats came, when the familiar guilt was wielded like a dull blade, I didn't flinch. I watched the woman beside him step forward, anger flush across her face, as she hurled accusations of incompetence and weakness. But none of it pierced me. None of it reached the place inside me where I used to carry fear, because those places had been emptied, cleaned, rebuilt in the long, quiet hours of the previous night. And when he finally walked away, shouting that I would die alone, shouting that I had made my choice, shouting that I was no longer part of his life, I felt the words hit me but not break me, because for the first time I understood that sometimes choosing yourself is not abandonment, sometimes it is survival. And as their car disappeared down the street, I closed the door gently, feeling the weight of the house around me shift, as if acknowledging a change long overdue. And standing alone in that quiet, I knew that what came next would not be easy, but it would be mine. I closed the door and stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet press against me until it felt almost physical, and I could hear my own breath echoing in the empty hallway, like someone else's voice. And that was when the real shift began, the kind that doesn't arrive with noise, but with a tightening in the chest, a clarity that feels both terrifying and inevitable. And I walked back to the table where the laptop still sat open, glowing faintly like an accusation, and I pulled it toward me because I knew that silence from him wouldn't last long. The next blow would come, not through words but through pressure, manipulation, threats disguised as family duty. And I wasn't going to let myself be unprepared ever again. And I opened every document, every message, every financial thread tying us together, and I examined them like pieces of machinery failing in slow motion, and the longer I looked, the clearer the picture became. He wasn't drowning, he was sinking himself willingly, dragging me down only to stand on my shoulders and keep breathing. And when the next email arrived, its subject line written like an ultimatum, like a final threat, wrapped in the language of righteousness, I felt no panic, only a cold resignation, because the words inside were predictable: accusations of betrayal, rewritten history, demands to choose between my future and his carefully crafted crisis, and the phrase "last chance" was repeated as if he were offering me salvation instead of a sentence. And for a moment I imagined the late woman standing behind me, her hand on my shoulder, steady and warm, reminding me that this wasn't love, this was desperation, sharpened into entitlement. And I forwarded the message to the one person who could help me sever every tie, cleanly and without hesitation. The lawyer who had helped me through the worst chapter of my life, the one who saw my grief without taking advantage of it. And I called her because, if they were willing to escalate, I needed to be ahead of the storm, not waiting for it. And the next morning her office smelled faintly of peppermint and printer ink, and the stack of documents she placed in front of me felt heavier than paper should feel, and she guided me through each step, her voice steady enough to anchor me, the trust locking the house beyond. Reach the accounts shielded from any attempt to infiltrate, the will rewritten into truth, not obligation. And I felt the weight of each signature like a quiet reclaiming of ground I had lost without noticing. And then came the last decision, the one I had been circling around without naming it out loud, the one that felt like tearing a page out of my own history, selling the house, the place, filled with memories good and unbearable. And I hesitated for a single heartbeat before telling her to proceed. And the look she gave me wasn't pity, it was approval, the kind reserved for someone who finally stops bleeding long enough to stitch himself back together. And by noon, the first motions were already in place, and I walked out of that office feeling like a man stepping out of a long tunnel into winter air, sharp, bright, unforgiving but clean. And when the afternoon sun slid lower in the sky, I knew he would come again, because people who rely on control don't give it up quietly. And right on cue, the shouting started at the door, the pounding loud enough to vibrate through the floorboards, and I watched him from the window try the lock again, confusion twisting into rage, and I stayed still listening, because every word he threw at the house wasn't new. It was a repetition of every guilt tactic he had used for years, and when he screamed about betrayal, about obligation, about how parents exist to fix the lives of their children, I felt nothing except a strange, distant sadness, and I stepped to the room door, but didn't open it. Not yet, not again. Instead, I watched his anger burn itself out, watched the fury collapse into disbelief, then into fear, because for the first time in his adult life, I wasn't bending, not even a little, and I finally opened the main door, keeping the barrier firmly in place between us, and I let him speak. Let him break open the full weight of his entitlement until the words became noise. And when there was a pause just long enough for breath, I told him the truth, not as punishment, but as fact, that everything he feared was already in motion. The protections, the documents, the decisions, the reality that I was no longer the person he could twist into shapes that suited him, and when the woman beside him raised her voice and threatened courts and accusations and incompetence, I didn't look at her because none of this was about her. She was only an echo, amplifying the worst parts of him. And when I said I had already passed a cognitive assessment, the silence that followed cut through the air like something sharp, and I watched panic flicker behind his anger, watched the realization dawn that he had miscalculated badly, and he said I was abandoning him, said I was choosing greed over love, said I was destroying the family. And I answered softly, "No, I am choosing truth, and that truth is something you taught me to ignore for too long." And he left after throwing one last threat over his shoulder about how I would regret this growing old alone without him, and I closed the door on his words before they could attach themselves to me the way they once did, and in the silence that followed, I felt something shift, not a victory, not relief, but the unmistakable beginning of an ending, the kind that hurts before it heals, and the kind that once it begins, cannot be undone. I will continue exactly as instructed. Jiviet, Kong Hoi, Kong Tra Lui Tua, Kong Sung Dong, Kong Dach Noi, Kong Ten Rieng, Bam Sat Kot Tuyen Tong transcript, Ro Nen, Lien Mut Hoi, PHN 4 to 909 Tunsa. I woke the next morning with a strange stillness clinging to the house, the kind that comes after a storm when the air feels too quiet, almost suspiciously calm, and I walked through the rooms, touching doorframes and walls as if trying to understand whether anything had changed or whether it was only me who had shifted, and the truth settled slowly. I no longer felt afraid of his reaction, no longer felt the weight of his accusations hanging over me like a chain, and the decision I had made the day before echoed like a quiet promise inside. My ribs and I went about the tasks ahead with a kind of precision that surprised even me, contacting movers, organizing documents, packing away the pieces of a life I had built over decades, and every item I lifted carried a memory, some tender, some heavy, some tied to the late woman whose presence still lingered in these rooms like a fading scent, and I found myself pausing over her, things feeling the ache of nostalgia twist through me, but even that ache had softened into something gentle, something grateful, instead of paralyzing, and I spent hours sorting what to keep, what to give away, what belonged to a life I no longer needed to carry, and the more boxes filled, the lighter I felt, like shedding a skin that had grown too tight without me noticing. And by midday, I reached the moment I had been dreading, unlocking the workshop, packing the tools, the items that held pieces of my grief and healing woven together, and I thought about how many nights I had stayed down there just to escape the loneliness, how many times sanding a piece of old wood had felt like reassembling myself after the late woman was gone, and the thought that I was leaving this space behind carried a sharp sting, but also something close to hope, because maybe healing wasn't in the room itself, but in the hands that shaped the work, and those hands I was taking with me. And as the hours passed, the house began to empty, losing its familiar warmth, becoming something hollow, something that no longer felt like mine, and that emptiness was exactly what I needed, because the only home that mattered now was the one I was choosing, not the one I had been clinging to out of habit or fear. And late in the afternoon the knock came softer this time, not the pounding from before, but a hesitant tapping, like someone unsure whether they were welcome, and I knew without checking who it was. And when I opened the door, He stood there with a tension in his shoulders, as if the previous confrontation had not gone the way he expected, as if reality had finally started tightening its grip around him, and he looked into the half-packed hallway and said, "Only one sentence. You're really doing this, aren't you?" And I answered with a simple yes, because anything more would have invited another spiral of blame, another storm of accusations, another attempt to drag me back into the role I had played for too long. And he stepped back as though the word had hit him, and he scanned the boxes, his expression shifting from disbelief, confusion, and then finally to a kind of anger that flickered but didn't fully ignite. And he asked where I was going, asked why I was leaving, asked if I understood what this meant for him, and for once I answered without hesitation, saying, "This isn't about you, not anymore." And those words seemed to disarm to him, like he hadn't expected me to see myself as separate from his needs, and he sputtered about abandonment, about responsibility, about loyalty. But every word bounced off a wall he could no longer climb, and the more he spoke, the more obvious it became that he understood the truth. Deep down, he had pushed me away long before I ever closed the door. And when the woman at his side tried to step forward again, her voice thick with fury, her threats sharper than before, I barely glanced at her because she no longer had any role in the ending of this chapter, and I repeated the same calm sentence I had rehearsed for myself, that I had protected what I built and that I owed them nothing more, and I watched both of them flinch at the word nothing, because entitlement turns even simple boundaries into violence, and they turned away, finally retreating down the drive, the tension between them cracking with every step, and I closed the door softly, feeling the house exhale with me, and night fell as I continued preparing for the move, knowing with a certainty I had never felt before that I was stepping into a life untouched by manipulation, a life that belonged to the man I was before grief softened me into something too pliable, too easily bent. And early the next morning the moving truck arrived, the driver asking polite questions, the kind that fills silence, and I loaded the last remnants of my old life into the back, knowing I would never return to this street, never return to this version of myself. And when the realtor called saying the offer had been accepted, above asking, I felt no triumph, only a quiet completion, the kind that comes when a door closes fully without leaving a crack. And as I drove away, the house shrinking behind me, I felt a pull in my chest, not regret, not sorrow, but the unmistakable sensation of stepping into open space after being trapped too long, and the road ahead felt wide and unfamiliar and alive. And for the first time since the late woman had left this world, I felt like I was moving towards something, instead of running from the emptiness she left behind. I settled into the small house far from the city with the kind of exhaustion that sits deep in the bones, the kind that grows after months of conflict and quiet heartbreak. And as I unpacked the last boxes, the silence felt strange, almost too gentle, like the world around me had exhaled after holding its breath through every confrontation, every demand, every threat. And the first nights alone were softer than I expected. No shouting, no tense phone calls, no footsteps coming up the driveway, no guilt hanging in the air, just the sound of wind brushing against the old windows and the distant rustle of leaves from the trees lining the bay. And each morning I woke with the uneasy sensation that someone might appear at the door again, relentless, furious, ready to drag me back into their collapsing world. But no one came, and the days stretched into something peaceful, something almost healing, and I walked through the small town, learning the rhythm of its streets, the friendly nods of strangers, the hum of ordinary life, the simple beauty of a place where no one knew who I had been or what I had endured. And for the first time in years, people asked nothing from me. They simply greeted me with warmth, curiosity, or quiet kindness. And slowly, the tension inside me unwound, thread by thread, until I could breathe without expecting punishment. And then the call came from the lawyer, telling me the woman had filed for divorce, telling me the debts I once suspected were far worse than I imagined, telling me that the life they had projected so confidently was nothing more than a tower built on borrowed money and lies. And I pictured him not as the angry man pounding on my door, but as someone sitting alone among the pieces of the world he constructed with bravado and denial, and the image struck me with a strange mixture of sorrow and clarity. Because sometimes destruction is not cruelty, it is consequence, and the truth buried under all the process, shouting was now finally catching up to him, and my own life began unfolding. In a quiet, steady way, I joined a group of older craftspeople, strangers, who became companions in the workshop, the smell of sawdust and oil becoming something like medicine as I shaped pieces of old wood into something useful again, and I felt myself returning to who I had been before. Grief hollowed me out before guilt, made me pliable before. Love made me blind, and sometimes in the evenings I would walk down to the water and stand at the edge of the bay, listening to the waves bumping against the rocks, thinking about the late woman and wondering if she would approve of the life I was building away from everything we once shared, and each time the wind shifted lightly across my face, I felt as if she were telling me yes, telling me that life does not end when things fall apart. It remakes itself in small, quiet ways, and as winter crept across the water, I found myself no longer dreading the cold, because the cold carried stillness, and the stillness carried space for me to simply exist without bending for anyone. Then the silence between me and him stretched for months. No calls, no messages, no demands, only emptiness that felt both like punishment and protection, and I used that time to carve out a version of myself that had been buried under decades of sacrifice, learning how to wake without fear, learning how to move without permission, learning how to live in a world where I was not expected to save anyone from their own mistakes. And then one day the phone buzzed, a simple message, asking to talk, and I didn't answer right away because old habits cling to the heart even when the mind knows better. And I took time, days of it, letting the fear settle, letting the walls inside me settle into place, not to shut to him out forever, but to ensure I would not collapse at the first sound of his voice again. And when the conversation finally happened, his tone was so different, I barely recognized it. Quieter, stripped of performance and entitlement, like a man who had finally stepped out from behind his own lies. He admitted everything, the fantasy, the debt, the spiral, the pretending, the downfall that had taken everything with it, and I listened, not with anger but with the strange heaviness of a parent, hearing the truth they feared and wished for in equal measure. I heard the fragility in every sentence, the weariness, the shame, the quiet, cracking open of someone who had run out of illusions to hide behind, and as he spoke I felt the sharp edges inside me dull, not with forgiveness but with understanding, because sometimes people must lose everything before they can see what they have become, and I realized that the distance I had created had not destroyed him, it had allowed the truth to reach him for the first time. And when he asked if I could ever forgive him, I spoke carefully, choosing words that would not bind me again, but would allow both of us to move forward. And he cried, the kind of crying that does not demand anything, the kind that simply admits defeat. And I let him because tears were the first honest thing he had given me in years. And when the call ended, I stepped outside into the early spring air, watching the thin ice on the bay crack open along the 20 shore, thinking about how fragile and resilient things can be at the same time, and I realized I was finally living not as someone reacting to chaos, but as someone shaping a life with his own hands, one quiet day at a time. And though I didn't, I know what the future held between us. I knew this: I had survived the breaking, and now I was learning the rebuilding. The months that followed unfolded the way a slow sunrise does, gentle at first, almost unnoticed, until one morning you look around and realize the light has shifted, the shadows softened, the world carrying a different tone, and I found myself stepping into routines that felt like stitching a new skin. Over old wounds, early walks along the bay, watching the water turn from steel to silver as dawn crept across it, afternoons in the workshop shaping quiet purpose into pieces of wood, evenings spent at the small community center where laughter and ordinary conversation filled the spaces that used to echo with disappointment, and I kept expecting the past to claw its way back, demanding attention, demanding sacrifice, demanding a return to the old cycles. But the days stayed steady and silent, except for the soft pulse of the town and the occasional message from the lawyer updating me on the final stages of documents and loose ends. And then one morning a simple message arrived, asking if he could come up for a weekend. Not urgent, not manipulative, not wrapped in grief or demand. just a plain question from someone learning how to exist in truth for the first time. And I sat with it, letting the familiar ache rise, letting the fear of repeating old patterns tug at me before answering, because trust, once broken, is like cracked wood. It can be repaired, but only with patience and honest care. And when the weekend came, he stepped off the bus, carrying a small, worn backpack and wearing clothes that looked lived in instead of curated. And for a moment I saw not the angry man pounding on my door, but the boy who once followed me around the garage, handing me tools with a seriousness that made me laugh. And he smiled in a way I had not seen in years, uncertain but real. And we drove back through the winding roads toward the cottage, neither of us speaking much, because sometimes silence is the only safe bridge between two people trying to find each other again. And during that visit, something subtle shifted. We worked side by side, sanding a small piece of furniture I had been restoring for a neighbor, and I watched him concentrate the way he once did as a child. And he asked careful questions, not the kind meant to impress, but the kind meant to learn. And I could feel him trying not to overstep, not to lean too hard, not to assume. Forgiveness was guaranteed, and in the quiet rhythm of sanding and shaping, I felt a small softening inside me, something not quite forgiveness, but the beginning of it. And on the second day, he handed me an envelope, his fingers trembling slightly, and he told me to open it. And inside was a check, not large, but meaningful, simply because it came not from entitlement, but from effort, from long hours earned at a job that paid more in humility than money. And he said it wasn't repayment. It was a symbol, a gesture to prove to himself that he could give instead of take, that he could begin again from zero. And I held the check and felt a strange warmth rise in my chest. Not pride exactly, but something close to it. Something like watching a seed finally push through the soil. After years of lying dormant, and after he left that Sunday evening, I walked down to the shoreline, holding the check in my hand before depositing it the next morning, alongside a matching donation to the foundation, honoring the late woman because she had been the one who believed he could grow. She had been the one who saw his potential even when he didn't, and it felt right that her memory should stand beside this small beginning of his redemption. And the seasons rolled forward, winter melting into spring, spring warming into summer, and each visit from him arrived not with excuses or pleading, but with stories of progress, slow and imperfect, but real. His first small promotion at work, his evenings spent in classes, his new relationship with someone who lived simply and honestly, someone who knew what rebuilding looked like. And each time he visited, the heaviness between us lightened like a weight gradually untied. And the moment that truly settled, everything came on a quiet autumn afternoon, the two of us standing before the stone that marked the late woman's resting place, the leaves falling around us in slow drifting spirals. And he set down the flowers with a reverence I had not seen since he was a child. And he spoke softly, not to me but to her, telling her he was trying, telling her he was changing, telling her he hoped she could forgive him for the years he spent pretending he didn't need help. And the words cracked something in me that had stayed tight and aching. And I placed a hand on his shoulder and told him what was true, that she forgave him before he ever failed, that she loved him enough to want him to learn his own strength. And we stood there, two men finally stripped of ego and bitterness, letting the truth settle between us. And when we walked back to the car, he turned to me, and I said thank you, not for the money, not for the move, not for the boundaries, but for the hardest thing, letting him fall so he could rise on his own. And I realized then that the pain of letting go had not been destruction, it had been release. And as we headed back to the cottage, the bay glowing under the soft evening light, I felt a kind of peace settle into me, one I had never known even in the years before. Everything fractured, and I understood that life had not ended. When I walked away from the home that no longer held me, it had begun, there quietly, in the choice to protect myself, in the choice to trust the truth, in the choice to love, without losing myself. And that was the lesson I would carry into whatever years remained, that sometimes the truest act of love is stepping back and letting the people we care for learn how to come home on their own.